Welcome to ChurchPulse Weekly. Carey Nieuwhof here. Hey, David, how's it going this week?
Pretty good, Carey. How are you?
Good. I love this David Kinnaman, by the way, Barna president. Yeah, summer's coming to an end and we run into a frantic season. And I know we've done an awful lot of research on anxiety and on the emotional state of leaders. I was just reading since our last show that top world virologist said anybody who thinks we're at the end of this pandemic doesn't understand pandemics. And I kind of read that and went, oh, are you kidding me? Like, come on, we're doing a little better here. But it's still a pretty unstable environment, isn't it, for leaders, which makes it even harder.
It is absolutely. And of course, as we've been saying, there's so many other fundamental shifts that have taken place in terms of what people expect, challenges for parents, for working moms, for anybody who's educating kids at home and has been. Obviously, there'll be some things coming into the fall that are a little more normal than there have been, but I think there's still this sense in which we're living in the shadow of all the disruptions, and in particular, our souls are living in the shadow of that. Our anxiety levels are higher than ever. Young adults coming out of college, or sort of who might have been disrupted in their educational sort of track, huge increases of anxiety across young adults, huge experiences of anxiety for church leaders. So many ways in which I think this topic of mental health, we've talked about this stat: 29% of senior pastors say they've given serious consideration to quitting in the last year. And so, I think mental health, anxiety, sort of the challenges of all the disruptions we've faced have been just layered onto an already pretty crazy, frenetic pace for those of us in the developed world.
Well, it's rather, I don't know what they call it, ironic. I don't know what the right term is, but you and I were doing some work in early 2020 before we even knew, what would happen to the world. So this is pre-COVID. It was sort of a story overseas somewhere at the time. And Barna had really been digging into the 5 dimensions of human flourishing. And it was enough of a challenge back then, right? But when you look at how people are flourishing, I don't think we've ever been through 2 years that have been a greater challenge to human flourishing in our lifetime than we have over these last 2 years. And yet the question, David, becomes, how can the church help? And you've got some research on that, right? Where can churches fill in the gap? What are you discovering on that?
Well, one of the things we've been looking at, we did this big study in May and June, looking at sort of the health of, various communities. We're doing a lot of cities research, Barna cities, and then we're doing this national study, and we asked people about where they believe the church could be most helpful. And so in the past, there's so much discussion around the church helping, in spiritual lives, getting people saved, helping people grow and discipled into Christ. And that is, in essence, the calling of the church. But we also see places in Scripture where, we're called to grow whole life disciples, in terms of their emotional and mental health, their financial well-being, their spiritual health, of course, their vocational well-being, all these are relationally or those are these 5 dimensions of human flourishing. So when we ask people about if they would like Christian churches in their community offering preaching and programs to help them achieve relational well-being, 3 in 5 adults in our country, 62%, said they'd be interested in that. And in particular, 82% of practicing Christians said they'd be interested in that. Millennials were more likely than older generations to say they'd be interested in the church offering preaching and programs on relational well-being. And this is, again, just one of these 5 dimensions of human flourishing. And then on the subject of mental and emotional well-being, a similar proportion, 65% of U.S. adults said they'd be interested in Christian churches in their community offer preaching and programs to help them achieve mental and emotional well-being, another part of these dimensions of human flourishing. Among practicing Christians is 84%. So, one of my great hopes for the church is that it would actually see its calling in terms of discipling people, not just getting people saved, but actually discipling them in all of these areas and aspects of life, vocationally, mental and emotional health, relationally, financially, sort of like creating and equipping people who can live out their faith in all of life. And if Jesus doesn't matter in all of life, he doesn't matter in any of life. And it's not just getting people sort of ready for heaven and saved from hell, but also equipping them for life in this world in this way. And so I think it's really cool. Like I said, millennials are even more likely to say they want a church to express that kind of whole life discipleship. It's bringing preaching and programs into all of life.
It's interesting that 2/3 of American adults, 65% said, yeah, we want churches to speak into emotional and relational and the whole mental health space. I don't think a decade ago, people would have thought of that as an evangelism opportunity. It would be more like pastoral care or discipleship. But now we're in an age where we're in such an anxious age where that is a great way to reach people that you have. And of course, some of that is caring for yourself. So we're going to focus on all of that today as we bring in a really good friend of yours and a friend of mine, Rebekah Lyons. She is a national speaker, host of the Rhythms for Life podcast, and best-selling author of Rhythms of Renewal, You Are Free, and Free Fall to Fly. Through her speaking and writing, Rebekah speaks to her own battles of overcoming anxiety and depression and invites others to discover and boldly pursue their God-given purpose. Her work's been featured on The Today Show, Good Morning America, CNN, Fox News, Publishers Weekly, Starred Reviews, and a lot more. Rebekah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So we have all been through quite the year and a half together. Let's start personally, because every leader has a personal journey. There's what we're doing for everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. But you're heavily invested in the church. You're invested with your husband, Gabe, and Q Ideas and this movement and your own ministry. But you're somebody who's struggled with anxiety and some mental health challenges in the past. What have been some good parts of the pandemic for you, and what has been the hardest for you?
Yeah, I would say, if my greatest joy is to help equip the church on how to be on the front lines for those areas of relational, emotional, spiritual, and vocational health, then, last year I was going to be in 30 cities and I got through 7. And so when everything came to a hard stop, March 8th, 11th, whatever exact day that was, my last event was March 8th. I just remember going, okay, Lord, I know that this is not a surprise to you, this divine interruption. And, obviously we're all just reeling in the unknown and the fear of the future. But immediately I just felt a little bit of a peace. I would say that lasted for about 3 to 4 weeks, like a settledness. I go, okay, I'm going to surrender to this moment that none of us really asked for. None of us were looking for. There's a lot of pain and it's just unknown attached to it and loss. But I'm gonna sit in this, and I trust that, I think sometimes our timetable is just so short, right? Like, so within 4 weeks, the church is gonna, be revived. It's gonna be better than ever. And we're gonna all find that this was like a nice little jaunt of rest, because none of us are able to rest. And the American Institute of Stress pre-COVID said 4 out of 5 of us have physical symptoms of stress. So to me, it was almost a good news in the fact that it forced all of us to pause and have a pause that got longer and longer. I think that was where it started to become disorienting, because we all understand Sabbath, whether it's, 1 day out of the week or maybe 1 year out of 7. But when it got longer and longer with no end in sight, it's kind of that hope deferred makes the heart sick. There was this angst that starts to rise as a people of God who go, we were made to gather. We were made to be with one another. We're a communal people made by a communal God, and we're all isolated to our own spaces. And there's a level of distrust and like who's contagious and who's not, and how do I stay safe? There's a little bit of self-preservation that sets in, and it's less about us being with one another and more about us kind of being against one another. So to me personally, I found that as it continued to unfold, I had to almost go to the secret place with the Lord and go, okay, bring me back to my first love, where when I walked through that season of panic disorder, where I just depended on you so much for what I couldn't see, what I didn't know, and where I didn't know where the end in sight was. And so what that required of me, so anxiety wants to surge when you have a history of that. There's that neuroplasticity, the muscle memory in the brain is going, this is what we do when we're triggered. And this is where the fight or flight or freeze starts to take place. And what that's looked like for me in this last year is just to be more vigilant in rhythms of health. And so what that's looked like for me is I probably walk every sunrise and every sunset most days, especially when we had nowhere else to go, right? But especially even now, as I re-enter there are things that I adopted in this last year that I don't ever want to leave. I had the space and the time to cultivate a real hunger for learning, a hunger for embodiment, as far as movement in discipleship. I think sometimes we sit and we listen and we take notes, but I listen to all podcasts now while I walk. I like do power walking. I'm like kind of that annoying person that walks too fast, so you kind of don't want to walk with me. But to me, it's almost like whether it's a sermon by Tim Keller, whether it's a personal growth, whatever it is, I feel like I'm embodying a very present way of being healthy, even in the unknown, even in the pause, even in the reset, to come back to something, in my hope, stronger, more grounded, more rooted in a posture of letting go and trusting that God is doing a new thing right now for the church, just like he's doing it in each of us individually. He's also doing it corporately. And what I sense that is, not that I will speak for God on any level, what I sense that is a decision for rootedness. Whether it's local communities, we're not as transient maybe as we were prior to this. We're less fractured in a bunch of different places. My prayer for myself is that there would be a deeper grounding that comes out of this. And with that comes a clarity, a crystal clarity of calling, of assignment, and what the delivery of that actually looks like.
So
Like
good.
a laser focus, if you will, because you have enough time to silence all the noise and then come back to center and go, God, what was the first love that began this vocational work in the first place? Bring me back there. The passion, the dependency, the trust, and the risk. Bring me back to that place. I don't want to go back to autopilot where we kind of figured it out and we were just kind of coasting. I want to come back to innovation. I want to come back to creativity, excitement, risk. And if that looks different than the way it used to be, then I'm okay with that.
It's so good, Rebekah. I'm just grinning here thinking about the journey Gabe Lyons and I, your husband and I, have been on, and you and I, just this thinking back to almost 20 years ago when Gabe and I met, and then the work on, the brand of Christianity study, which became Unchristian, and thinking about, our efforts to serve the church. That was the early days of Q and the early days of my stepping into leading Barna about 12 years ago when I took over for George Barna. But what do you think has changed in the church? How do you see the church today? And, what are opportunities that we have that, this sort of vision, we're sort of midway through our efforts, as the Lord allows, or sort of midway through our efforts. We were young leaders at the time dreaming of a better church, and we've invested, the better part of our work lives now doing that. And my passion for the church is just growing day by day. But what from your vantage point, what do you see in our areas of hope, challenges that you see sort of 10, 15 years since we began this journey?
I see only hope, honestly. I mean, of course, you can only go uphill you get to a point where you're like, we can only go uphill from here, right? So I see hope. And here's how I see hope, based on what you and I and the history you just shared. It's the study that you just shared at the beginning of the session, right? This podcast, where it's what are people needing? What are they longing for? What do they want the gospel? How do they want the gospel to actually be true and play out in their everyday interactions as husband and wife, as parents, as teammates, as best friends, as coworkers? How are we relationally strong? How are we physically strong? How are we mentally strong? How are we spiritually strong? And what that means is the church has to actually be a witness without words. We've gotten very comfortable with being a witness with words, like that our witness is what we say. And I think what the world outside of these walls of our churches is saying, no, I want to see that you are a Christ follower by what you do, and by how you live, and by how you treat one another. And of course, that was Jesus' final prayer, is that we would be one. And to be one requires a whole lot of mutual submission, sacrifice, surrender, giving up your life for something else, for someone else. And I think the church has gotten so loud with a megaphone, but what we haven't done is we haven't done the way of Jesus, which is the embodiment of witnessing, and where he would just be. He was, and he would be. And as his disciples, I think when he said, follow me, and just to me, the physicality of walking out the scriptures is a healing. That's a healing in itself. We can talk about the healing of God and we can pray for the healing of God, and that is very real. But if we don't live the healing of God, then we're doing what you said earlier. We're thinking about like, where do I go in the afterlife and how secure is my footing there? But Jesus even reverses those questions, and he goes, even about the Samaritan, that parable, he says, if you do this, if then you will live. They're saying, what must I do to enter the kingdom? And he said, if you do this, you will live. And what he's saying is, you can do this, love your neighbor, the person who's half dead, and I use air quotes, but whoever that person is that's struggling and suffering in your path, if you don't ignore them and you pay attention to them, you have mercy on them, you care for them. He's saying, if you do this, you live now. You live now. You live the full embodiment of the gospel here on earth as it is in heaven. And I think if we grasp that as a church, what is the embodiment, the physicality of being a disciple of Jesus today and tomorrow and next week, starting from our homes and then outside those walls into our communities, then all of a sudden we're talking about flourishing. It's not just an idea that we're hearing and we're taking notes about and we're writing it all down, but we're actually doing it. And it becomes like air. It becomes like the air we breathe. It's second nature. And to me, that's very exciting because it awareness breeds action. So if we are aware of these stats and we're aware of our own shortcomings, our own frailty, our own suffering, our own temptation or prone way of having depression or anxiety or sleepless nights. I mean, I'm very aware of that. I know my proclivity to go to those places when I'm not embodying the rhythms that bring flourishing. And so to me, if a church can help its people understand that, like breaking the bread physically and making the meals physically and taking and welcoming the stranger physically into your home and doing the actual actions that Jesus commands, not just hearing them and talking about them and taking notes, that is our healing. That is our healing as a church.
Well, it's interesting, Rebekah, and I'm going to get super nerdy here, so feel free to call me out. Okay. But
hey, that's my department, man. Come on.
Okay. Well, then I'm probably going to be, you're right. It's hard to get nerdier than
it's hard to get nerdier than David
So
Kinnaman.
maybe I'm not getting
the quote of the session for sure.
There you go. For sure.
There you go. Well,
you wear it well.
Extremely well. Yeah. You mentioned sleeplessness. So I was on a call with a bunch of pastors, and not being able to sleep at night showed up, and it led into a deeper conversation. Pretty much everyone on the call and their kids were having trouble sleeping at night. And then it got into, when they talk about their teenage children, almost their children and all of their friends were on some kind of sleep aid, maybe not necessarily, prescription, but like melatonin. Because anxiety, I used to think of anxiety as a mental thing. And of course, what we're learning over the last 20 years is, no, this is very physical, that there are symptoms. You can't sleep at night. You've talked very publicly about panic attacks, about, and more people seem to be experiencing them. I forget whether this was a conversation we had or whether, I think it's in your next to last book of Rhythms of Renewal. And you hinted at it in the first question or answer. You said you get out in the daylight, in the morning, and at night. I was listening to the Tim Ferriss show, and he was talking to a sleep expert, and he said a very similar thing about programming yourself to sleep at night by getting out into the open air first thing in the morning after sunrise. Can you talk about what you've learned about that? Was that in your book, or was that a conversation 100%. Or both? Okay, can you go there?
Okay, so some of it's in the book, some of it's been like even new learning since the book in the last year and a half. So the circadian rhythm is what governs our ability to sleep. And that ruled the day until the digital revolution and the industrial revolution that left machines on overnight, factories, because it was more efficient to keep things always on. And then now, most recently, the digital revolution, putting a device in your hand with a blue light that tells you to wake up constantly. So that's why our kids aren't sleeping. So it's literally science. It's science as to why we aren't sleeping. It doesn't mean that you have trust issues with God and that, you're demon possessed. It's like truly the fact that the circadian rhythm was meant by God, intended by God to govern our sleep and our ability to rest. So a sunrise emits blue light that tells you to wake up. So if you get outside in the morning, I sit on my front porch like an 80-year-old, and I love it. And I watch the sunrise at 5:30, 6 in the morning. It's the most glorious time. I listen to the birds wake up. We live on a little patch of land, and it's the most life soul giving, like his mercies being new every morning has never been more real to me than embodying that on the front porch and watching the orange glow and the sun come up. The sunset at night emits red light, which is natural melatonin for your body. Isn't that amazing? That before supplements, before medication and supplements, God actually already had a plan in place to help our bodies wake up and help our bodies fall back asleep. So some of the rules of science is to put your phone down when the sun goes down. Like if you're still on a digital device after the sun has set, you are messing with your circadian rhythm, and now you're trying to take melatonin to do what the sunset was trying to do naturally. And the problem with artificial melatonin is then it reduces your body's ability to produce it because it becomes a replacement. I used to do more melatonin. Now I'm off melatonin because it actually over time shortened the span it worked. Like if I went to bed at 10 p.m., I was still wide awake at 3 a.m. And it was shortened. And then all of a sudden your body can't actually physically get back to sleep without another dose again to produce it artificially. So all that to say, even just the practical steps of a device. I mean, if you think about it, our kids aren't sleeping because they're on screens. It's not because if they were running around outside in nature all day long without a screen, they would be snoring at night. But their brains have been so conditioned to be entertained, to be hardwired, to always have input. And the grounding effect of being outdoors is really the antidote to all the digital, but we're not doing it. So we're just taking in all the digital input, but we don't have an output that's really released in oxygen and vitamin D and sunshine and all that. So for me, I had horrible insomnia. Honestly, I was always on planes early and I was traveling a lot, and I hadn't slept more than 3 to 4 hours at a time for probably the last 7 years. And in the last few months, I just said, God, if you and I, if we can't figure this thing out, I used to think it was, precious that I would, get up and journal on the floor of my closet every night, like God wanted to meet with me. And I think sometimes he's like, no, I actually really like you to get some sleep because when you sleep, it washes your brain. It actually takes all the debris off of your brain. It's a superpower that gives you all the energy you need the next day. Otherwise, you're just operating on reserves. And I found it impacting every area of my life, my vocation, my relationships, my role as a mother, a wife, a friend, a daughter, a sister. And I was like, I got so like, Lord, we've got to break through on this. And so I just started, like I said, vigilant. Every morning I'm outside for about 30 to 40 minutes walking as the sun is rising or a little bit after. Every evening at sunset, I'm outside walking, and I'm remapping my brain to be on the circadian rhythm. I also take natural supplements like not melatonin anymore, but I take magnesium, 3 and 8. It actually allows you to sleep longer than the 3 hours. It breaks that blood-brain barrier and allows you to sleep longer, but it's natural. Sometimes you can add in theanine or GABA, whatever those things are that are natural. And I'm sleeping through the night. And it's the first time in like a decade. And I just feel like I could run a marathon right now. I literally feel like the amount of energy that could come from uninterrupted sleep for so many of us in leadership who haven't had that for so long, we don't even realize that we're operating at about 30% of our capacity. That's how detrimental and damaging it is. So that's the reason why we're having a hard time having these conversations in our churches, is that we as leaders are so struggling. That you're coming to an empty well. We're trying to actually nourish and shepherd the flock. And we're going, I'm actually personally hanging by a thread over here. Yeah. And so if we can't take it personal as leaders to go, I will do the work to figure this out so that I can have some fruit that the Lord provides to offer to nourish someone else, then I don't know how to help. I don't know how to help people, because sleeplessness is one of the leading triggers for all mental health disorders.
I'm not a doctor, but I just have struggled with sleep over the years. And about a decade ago, I was dependent on prescription sleep medication, whatever they put me on. And I remember thinking originally it was time zones and travel and continents and hemispheres and all that stuff. And then eventually I'm like, I can't sleep without this. So I weaned myself off by the grace of God. And I've
Yeah,
been
it's awesome.
experimenting with sleep for the last decade. And actually on my month off, I've had no alarm for a couple of years unless I have to catch a flight, which has been
Right.
very rare in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
But I'm amazed at how much sleep my body needs. And I've moved myself from 5.5 hours to about 8, or sometimes when I was off for a month, I did 9 hours of sleep a day.
Hmm.
And the difference is unbelievable. The clarity of thinking, my mood, even like, and I would just think if that's all you tuned in for today to listen to this, and you know how to get away and get some sleep. And there is a lot of brain research about exactly what you're saying about being out in the morning. Do you have a condo or apartment hack? Like I'm on a half acre, you're on a farm, or you have some land. What if you're in a city? You're in a
Yeah.
condo tower, you're on floor 15 of a 38-story thing, and the only light you see is through the glass. Any cheats on that or
Right.
strategies?
And let's just acknowledge really quickly, all the Wi-Fi has a lot of electromagnetic waves that if you have a sensor like my nerdy husband does, he'll take the sensor up and he'll see like how much electromagnetic waves are near your bed that come from your laptop, from,
Wow.
yeah. And if it's a lot, that actually is interrupting your sleep, which is why it doesn't matter if you live in a tower or whatever, you've got to get your devices away from your bed.
Stop
Anything.
charging your phone by your bed. We
Yes.
took
So
all devices out of our bedroom years
yes,
ago.
yes,
Yep.
yes. And some people who are single are like, what do I do? Because trust me, I have a lot of sweet single girlfriends who are like, that phone is kind of my security blanket. You know, if I needed to call somebody and I'm alone, I'm like, okay, I hear you. Put it on the floor across the room at least. Keep it in your bedroom if you feel like you need to have it in your bedroom. Don't have it on your bedside stand. Just don't. Just removing it. And those sensors show like you can have like 5.0 and then it goes down to 0.0 of those waves that actually are happening. They're affecting your brain while you're trying to sleep just by removing them by 10 feet. So that's one thing. I lived in New York City. I understand how intentional you have to be to get in green space. But I think it was Albert Einstein, don't quote me. But he said that when he would get home, he would step barefoot in the grass, and that would be this grounding effect that would be the counter to all the electricity, you know, because again, he was back in the day when the early of this, but Gabe was reading something about this and how he said barefoot in grass is a grounding effect for all that's happening to us on a digital level. So what that means if you're living in a city is you just find your park. You find the park nearby. We lived on the Upper East Side those first 2 years, and I would walk to Central Park and I would just do that Southern loop with, hundreds other runners. And it was just removed enough from kind of the concrete jungle where there were green, it was green all around. And if you make that a priority to be in green spaces, even year round, if you can, just layer up, get the right clothing for winter. I cannot suggest highly enough how vital it is to get outside. You have to get outside. I had seasonal depression in the South because I never went outside. I moved to New York and I'm walking nonstop in 11-degree temps. And it was the first winter I did not have depression in January. The first winter after living in the South where it was mild winters. So there's something to be said for getting outside as much as possible, because again, that's God's creation. Like all this naturally happening in the plants and the birds and the growth and the gardens, that is for our good. Everything that God makes that doesn't need man's conditioning is for our good. And it does our body good, and not just eating things from the ground, but just being among those things from the ground. I'm hopeful that we create a culture for our kids that gets them back outside, but it begins with us doing it and making it a priority.
So good.
I could go on for an hour about that, but I would agree. And I had no winter exercise regime. I cycle, but I'm Canadian, so I get all 4 seasons, right?
Right.
So you can't really, I mean, there are people of winter bikes, fat tire bikes, they call them, and it does work, but I'm like, I'm not that hardcore. So I started running. just 3 to 5K. And I'll do it up to minus 15. So there's no excuses. If you're minus 15 Celsius, you can still run. And I would agree. It's the same thing. And, our summers are long, but our winters, the days are short. But I'll get out at sunrise at 7:30 or 8 in the dead of winter, go for a run 3 or 4 times a week. It makes such a difference.
Yeah.
Or shovel snow. You can do that. And I find then I got to go back inside. I can't have an outdoor office in winter. But you're right. I've spent a lot of time in cities over the last few weeks, and I was just noticing how much green space there is. In most cities have some green space nearby.
Yeah.
So that's great.
And when you have a home office in an apartment building in a tower, still put your desk near a window where you're trying to get as much in front of natural light. And then of course there's lots of lights you could buy that'll help with that.
You can buy all the artificial lights
but
that
it won't just happen. I mean, in even figuring out the supplements in those winter seasons that you need to double down on, whether it's vitamin D or A or C to help with, just viruses clearly, but building that immunity, I'm pretty religious about vitamins and supplements too, because here's the thing. I joked with my kids. I'm like, I'm in the not early 40s and just past the mid 40s, right? So I'm not going to tell you, but I'm just saying, Gabe has a book called Younger Next Year that he's giving out to every guy friend he has. And I said, yeah. And it's just this idea that your body at 50 just starts to stop. It starts to shut down. But if you put these practice of movement in place, you can sustain almost that same life rhythm until you're 80, but you've got to get ahead of it, right? You've got to kind of get into it and practice it. And to me, we as a church don't have something to author with our words. If people aren't looking at our life and going, that feels like a glimpse of what flourishing means. You still trust God. You're praying for healing. You're serving the poor. You're doing the things that are central to your heart, but you're also taking care of yourself in a way that you have something left to give to somebody else.
Well, as someone who can speak to both of you from my 50s, a few years ahead of you, I can tell you there's been a whole host of personal bests for me in my 50s, and I'm halfway through them. So
that's awesome.
That's good. You know what? And the Olympics hasn't called yet, but that's not my goal. My goal is to keep my mind, heart, and spirit fresh over the coming decades. God
there's
willing.
there's still time for you to join the Canadian curling team, Carey.
There is a sport.
You don't practice enough, Carey. That's the problem.
That is I'll stick to cycling. I'll stick to cycling. Big green egg to offset
I know.
it.
Gabe wants someone to join him on the seniors golf tour. So there you go.
That's not a bad thing.
You can all have
your
lanes.
Jack Nicklaus is still teeing off at the Masters. So there you go.
For me, it's been hiking the last 4 or 5 years. We've done some of the 14,000 foot peaks in Colorado, and spent a lot of time this summer hiking. And but to me, that's one of the things that as I'm getting into my just past the mid 40s, I'm excited to be just outdoors and just seeing the high places of the earth is amazing perspective. And so
what does that do for you? What does that do? Because you've been through the season too, as we talked about. I mean, losing Jill and going through everything. What has taking care of your physical body? Because whenever we're together, I'm always amazed. Like, David's in good shape. Like, you're in good shape. So what?
Well, thanks.
What does that do for you?
Not just a nerd.
No, a fit nerd. Even better.
Nerd.
There you go.
That's right. Well, for me, it's been looking back over the last 15, 20 years, I remember starting to I hated running, weight training. I literally thought that the people in college who did weight training were the dumbest people I've ever heard. Like you signed up to do physical. And so now that I'm in my mid 40s, I'm like, okay, I actually got to learn some weight training techniques and whatnot. But I was a big runner. I started running, hated running a mile, but I came to love it. And in my mid to late 20s, and now that's one of the best activities. I'm starting to feel some of the cumulative impact of all the miles I put on. So I've gotten into biking, and then for me, the hiking in the last 5 years in some of these most incredible places, Glacier National Park, the Rockies here in Colorado, where I happen to be recording today's podcast. And so just hiking for me has been one of these things where you get, you can feel the stress sort of come off in our home in California. There's plenty of great hiking. And you sort of just see the natural beauty. And I happened to read yesterday, Genesis 1 in this right next door to Rocky Mountain National Park. We're staying at a friend's cabin. And just to sort of think about how God has created, the earth and these, seed bearing plants, it's just worship for me. And so that when you go to the high places of the earth, where very little life can really live, and you get these little marmots, and you get, these low lying, kind of grass, you're above the tree line. And, you can see for, literally hundreds of miles. And it's just, sort of this perspective of how short our life is, and, just the beauty that we have, and that I won't always be able to do that. Right. So, it's been one of those things that I think helps me pause on all my ambition and try to just take in, what life has to offer, the beauty and the work. Cause it's when you're down off a 14er, you're just pretty exhausted. So anyway, for me, those are some of the good things.
I'm glad. And I love the fact that you admitted you hated exercise. So did I. I used to go to conferences as a pastor and be like, you got to take care of your body. There's my body connection. I'm like, shut up. And then I burned out at 40, and I started taking exercise seriously at 40, and 15 years on the other side. I'm not setting world records, but I got to tell you, I feel so much better. Were you a natural exerciser, Rebekah, or were you like trying to avoid that? Were you track and field in high school, or?
Yes, I gave jokes that I'm not very athletic, but I actually like recreation. So when I say athletic, like I'm getting better, but I'm not like precision with my aim and, really quick reflexes. I played basketball in my driveway because I just wanted to learn, and my older brother played a lot. And then I would run a lot in high school, but I do think it was a stress reliever. Even then I was, kind of had a leadership role that required a lot of me my junior and senior year. And it was kind of that outlet place. And then I would say that continued through college, cross country, and just lots of miles. I hurt my knee though. I injured my knee and didn't do the right repair. And so now I can't go much past like 4 to 5 miles. And so cycling or hiking, things that are just more sustainable, definitely lots of walking. My kids joke me that's not exercise, and it's not, but Pilates, different things like that are more core. But I think
kids are so grounding, aren't they?
Yeah, they keep you humble. Yeah. But like what you were saying, David, is that what for me in big nature, growing up in Florida where everything was like sea level, which is still wonderful, but getting out to Colorado a lot, we go out west a lot every summer. And it just reminds me of the vastness of God, the grandeur of like his creativity. It all of a sudden makes my things that feel big, very small. I just feel like I feel beloved and cherished in that smallness, that even how small I am in the nature and the grandness of what he creates, that he still sees and knows everything that I'm walking through. It's just a centering space for me. And it is worship. It is like, wow. I mean, it's infinite. Like your creativity is so infinite. And that's enough to just pause and just give us a posture shift of going, maybe the things I'm stressed about are so small in the grand scheme of like what you've made me for, or what you've cultivated for me to care for. And so to me, it's a centering reminder that God is at the helm at all times. And part of my purpose is is to be loved by him.
Well, I just want to say too, and I don't know if this has been your experience, I want to get to your new book, and then we need to wrap up because we're already at time. But I think this has been so helpful. A bit of a surprise. We didn't get to most of our questions, but almost every leader I admire would agree with what you had to share, and the importance of physical activity, of being outside, of getting away from work. Because often we have this view of like high capacity leaders as the people who never leave their desks, chained to caffeine or whatever they need to do. And most of the leaders I know that I really admire, like you think about a Eugene Peterson or something like that, just his rhythm of Sabbath and his tie to the land, and the people who really make significant contributions, I think would validate that. I would highly, highly recommend Rhythms of Renewal. But tell us about Surrendered Yes. Tell us a little bit about why you wrote that and what readers and leaders can expect from your new book, Rebekah.
Yes. So Surrendered Yes is my first devotional. And I love doing a devotional. I never had tried it before, but it's this idea of like, we're going to stick around and be together. 52 devotions for letting go and living free. And I found in the last decade that freedom was a slow and steady process of handing things over. Like we want a life of freedom, and but yet really what freedom looks like is like letting go of the weights and the sins that easily entangle us. And so for me, this last decade has been going, what are the things that I'm kind of holding on to with clenched fists out of control, which usually is masking fear, and that I, need to achieve this thing or be seen as this way or find success over here because somehow my worth is enmeshed in that somehow. And I think the Lord has just slowly kind of pulled those things out. And the surrendered yes is the yes to the interruption of God that we didn't ask for, we weren't looking for. It's often very painful. Sometimes it requires a whole lot of sacrifice and surrender. It requires some level of loss. And yet we choose to do that because we trust him. I mean, it's really answering that question, God, can I trust you? Like we really want to trust him like children, even if it might be just the answer might be a not yet, not yet. And raising Cade for 20 years as a special needs mom, I would say that trust never ends. And then bringing Joy home with a Down syndrome diagnosis as well, 2.5 years ago, that was a surrendered yes. We thought we were done and we're empty, quote unquote, empty nesters in 5 years, 20 years of marriage. And God just said, do you trust me again? Do you trust me with your work? Because at that point I was working. And I just think if we could get more comfortable and settled in with the idea of surrendering to whatever God is putting in our path, then we really do trust that his ways are higher than ours, that he sees our life from a vantage point that we can't see, that it's not always up and to the right, that the way of Jesus and the way of discipleship and spiritual formation is so much more in the trusting and surrender to all the things that we hold dear. And it's making our identity and our capacity fully grounded under his covering of grace and mercy every day. And so I've never seen manna like I see it now. You think about in the wilderness, manna was provided for that day. And for anyone who would try to save it for the next day, it would be infested with worms and it would be spoiled, because that was a sign of not trusting God. And so I'm asking God in this season of rebirth, coming out of COVID, of a new version of a reset. I like these midlife resets, like every decade. It's like, let's just pivot a little bit to what is closer to what you have instead of what I have. And I have found that in this new kind of venturing back out as we slowly open up, even though things are back and forth right now, just not returning to life the way I left it, and making sure the inside is a picture of what people see on the outside. And that's really what character and integrity is about. And I think it begins with the letting go of the things that I really thought I wanted, or letting go of the goals or the ambitions or the dreams that were mine, and coming back to God and going, your dreams are greater, not my dreams, but your dreams be done. Not my desires, but your desires be done. Not my idea of success, but your success be done. And I just want to stay there. And I know it's so hard, because the type A firstborn wants to take over and tell me that my worth is attached to my latest accomplishment. But God just says, actually, the most beautiful cadence we're going to find, a rhythm of health, which is what you really want. You really want vitality. You want flourishing. You want just connection in the deepest way with your people, is you just surrendering all these things to me, knowing I love you and I love your people more than you, and let go. Letting go is the hardest thing for people who are high capacity, but it's in our weakness his strength is made perfect. And I found again and again just the reassurance that I can trust him, that he sees my whole life from a vantage point. All my days were written and planned before one of them began. And I just don't want to waste any time trying to make things happen. That was God's big lesson to me a year ago. You don't have to make things happen. That was week 4 into COVID, on a walk where I just cried before the Lord. He's like, you don't have to make things happen. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to live like that is true.
That's awesome. I'm so glad we went here today, because it's so easy to talk about getting volunteers back and filling up that room and strategies and reaching more people and growth and all those things that honestly have their place. But if you don't get this right, you might not be doing that a year from now or 5 years from now, or certainly not in a healthy place or out of a healthy place. And if you're going to do this, if it's going to be a long obedience in the same direction, these are so essential. So the book is called A Surrendered Yes. Also very similar thought to what we've been talking about is your Rhythms of Renewal. You have the Rhythms of Renewal podcast that you do often with your husband, Gabe. And where can people find you online, Rebekah?
Just RebekahLyons.com.
Okay, so that's Rebekah with a K.
Yes.
And we're so excited for that. So the book is called A Surrendered Yes. You can get it anywhere books are sold. Make sure you're a great follow on social as well. So thank you, David. Thank you, Rebekah. And we hope you have a wonderful week, leaders. And please do try to get some sleep tonight. Arrested You